Nikita Khrushchev and Gamal Abdel Nasser changed the face of Egypt. After the West had refused a loan for a dam across the Nile, the Soviet Union took over. The emerging nations used the Cold War to get money and arms. The developing world was being courted.
В Европе уже границы закоченели, они были забетонированы.
In Europe, the borders were set in stone, and there was no opportunity of expansion there for either side. It would have started a new world war. Where could the hunting take place? To be rather crude, in those areas where there was still prey. That was the third world. And each side tried not to miss a chance.
Старалась не упустить случай.
In the Horn of Africa, the Soviet Union backed two rival and opposed regimes. For America, this was evidence of Soviet expansion. In Angola, thousands of Cubans poured in to fight South African troops backed by the United States. In Egypt, the Soviet Union supplied arms cheaply and on credit. But President Nasser wasn't easily influenced.
One shouldn't think of our relations with Nasser as the relations of master and servant. Nasser always pursued his own policy.
He was able to understand the global strategy, and now we can benefit from the disagreement between the Soviet Union and between the United States and the West, and make benefit of this situation to raise our capabilities militarily and economically.
Nasser was the hero of the Arab world. The Egyptians rallied for war. Nasser and the Arab states wanted to destroy Israel. Moscow did not. In 1948, the Soviet Union had supported the creation of the State of Israel on Arab lands. By 1967, Israel's 2.5 million Jews were surrounded by 90 million hostile Arabs. Israel felt insecure. The threat from Egypt became intense. Israel had America's political backing, but not her weapons. Would Israel get America's support for a surprise attack?
President Johnson asked us to bring Israel's foreign minister to the family quarters of the White House, and to speak rather crudely about it, the intent was to work him over, to persuade him, is perhaps a more polite term, to avoid a preemptive attack. We thought we had persuaded him.
Israel struck first. In less than 3 hours, 90% of the Egyptian Air Force was destroyed on the ground. The Israelis seized East Jerusalem. Jews were able to pray at the Wailing Wall again. The Israelis pressed on. Within 6 days, the armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan were routed. The map of the Middle East was transformed. Israel had trebled its size.
In the contest between Russia and America, within the Cold War in the Middle East, Israel was an automatic ally of the West. Since the Six-Day War, this automatic ally became a strategic asset.
America became Israel's principal source of arms. In the occupied territories, 1 million Arabs fell under Israeli rule. It was a devastating blow to Arab morale. The Soviets counted the cost.
Как бы наше оружие оказалось не столь эффективным, как
Our weapons turned out to be less effective than we calculated.
долг хотя бы, так сказать, возместить.
We felt that it was our duty to compensate, to supply more arms,
Опять же, поставить оружие и
and looking at the wider context, not to let the West win.
не дать выигрыша Западу.
September 1970, grief in Egypt at the death of President Gamal Abdel Nasser. The developing world mourned an outstanding leader. So did Soviet Prime Minister Kosygin. The mourners were uneasy, as were the Russians. Who could follow Nasser?
I shall do my best to follow the policy of the late president, my dearest friend, President Gamal. But no one will capitulate here in this country. I am not ready to capitulate or to surrender 1 inch or a bit of sand.
At the Moscow summit of 1972, the superpowers agreed on a code of conduct, détente. Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev agreed not to seek advantage at the other's expense. Better ties with America outweighed Moscow's commitments to the Arabs.
This angered Sadat because he felt that they were giving priority to détente with the Americans rather than helping Egypt wage a war.
But détente didn't stop American efforts to extend its influence in the Middle East at Moscow's expense.
Our policy in '72 was really to try to minimize and reduce the role. I'll go further, to keep the Soviets out of the situation.
We established the policy then that we would thwart any move backed by Soviet arms until some Arab leader would become so frustrated that he would turn to us for diplomacy, and then we would try to take as even-handed a position as we were capable of developing.
In Egypt, as in many other developing nations, the Soviet presence was huge. In July 1972, Sadat told the 15,000 advisors and their families to pack up and go. It was a bold power play. Sadat's move boosted his popularity and showed how little control the Russians really had.
By October '72, they decided to come back to the support of Egypt. And then Sadat make benefit from that. He says, well, I expel them to express power so that they would give us what we need. And strange enough, we had arms deal after the October, which was one of the biggest arms deal we've got with the Soviet Union.
Sadat needed the arms. He was planning to end the uneasy peace.
He wanted to go to war. He needed to go to war. He felt he couldn't do otherwise. He considered that negotiations were impossible without some heating of the whole process. I mean, some shock therapy.
Yom Kippur, Israel's most holy day. 4,000 Egyptian troops and tanks surged over the Suez Canal.
لحظة
We'd been waiting for this moment for 5 years, the moment of crossing the canal. Our cries shook the ground under the Israeli enemy. The cry of God is great made all our hair stand up on end.
The Egyptian army sped ahead, eager to retake lost territory. American Jews demanded immediate help for Israel. Washington was in a dilemma. Supplying its ally Israel risked sacrificing Arab goodwill. The State Department stalled.
There was an argument as to whether transport was available. And the Pentagon suggestion was that private transport be leased.
We were very disappointed and angry that supplies were arriving so slowly and only on El Al planes. The air convoy was delayed again and again.
The Egyptians kept up their attack.
The United States began to understand that we were in a serious situation when we suddenly changed our tune from this very blithe, typically Israeli self-confidence to a report that as a result of what happened, we were losing our lifeblood.
Sadat was triumphant. He had regained land Egypt lost in the Six-Day War. But the Russians sensed disaster ahead. They urged Sadat to accept a ceasefire.
He would benefit from a ceasefire. Otherwise, he'd be forced to retreat. But Sadat wouldn't listen.
In Washington, President Nixon ended the delay over the arms shipments.
Nixon said when the option was brought to him to send 2, 3 American planes, said, let's send a lot, because we are going to be criticized anyhow. And we will be criticized for whatever we do, for 1 plane or 2 planes, for 40 planes. So let's do it in an effective way.
The airlift put the world's largest power publicly alongside Israel. Now it was Moscow's allies that faced defeat. Now the Israelis crossed the Suez Canal into Egypt. Soon, most of the Egyptian army would be stranded in the Sinai.
Then Sadat got terrified. He spoke on the phone directly to Brezhnev. I was there. I remember him begging, save us from these Israeli tanks.
Cut off in the desert, the Egyptians faced defeat. Moscow called for a ceasefire.
They realized that the greater the military victory on the part of the Israelis, the greater defeat of Soviet supply, and a general weakening of the Soviet position in the entire region.
The Soviets and Henry Kissinger rapidly agreed proposals for a ceasefire. As Kissinger arrived in Israel to break the news to the Israelis, the superpowers' ability to restrain their allies would be tested.
We had made commitments which some of our leaders, especially Golda Meir and our Prime Minister, believed to have been rather rash. And when he landed, he said, I'm going to be chastised for this.
Israel wasn't yet willing to end the war.
Kissinger explained what happened, and he vowed to continue to help Israel in case there is a renewal of fighting.
With America's connivance, Israel stepped up its onslaught. The Soviets were outraged.
Brezhnev wrote a letter to Nixon saying, "How is it, when we've agreed to act jointly, that the Israelis are continuing to advance? It is undermining all our attempts to make peace." We suggested that both the Americans and the Soviets send troops to the Middle East to make Israel accept the ceasefire. But there was also a sentence that said, "If you won't do it, we will have to consider unilateral action."
The Soviet leaders had every reason to look at this as if there had been some sort of a plot. And they reacted very violently, and they sent us an extremely tough note saying that they want to join the American-Soviet intervention, and if not, they would act unilaterally.
Kissinger deliberately upped the ante. Determined to forestall any Soviet intervention in the Middle East, he placed American nuclear forces on heightened alert.
The basic purpose was to generate a lot of traffic that the Soviet Union would pick up before they received our reply to know that this was getting serious.
Moscow didn't react to the alert. They had already abandoned the idea of unilaterally sending troops.
That was clearly a political victory for the United States, a major political victory that had repercussions in a Cold War far beyond the Middle East.
Under American pressure, Israel allowed food and water to reach the trapped Egyptian army. Kissinger wanted Egypt defeated, but not destroyed. With the Israelis just 100 kilometers from Cairo, the Egyptians were forced into their first ever face-to-face talks with Israel. Moscow was not involved.
The Egyptians saw that the vehicle for getting on with what subsequently became disengagement agreements between Egypt and Israel, that it was the United States that carried all the cards.
Henry Kissinger became the world's most famous frequent flyer. Shuttle diplomacy gave him easy access to Sadat.
The relationship had fundamentally changed. I mean, since the war, Sadat believed that the main global party he should woo was the Americans.
Kissinger's travels didn't bring about permanent peace. They showed America was winning the Cold War in the Middle East, but there was a price to pay.
Я думаю, что эти события, они оказали
These events unfavorably affected the process of détente.
на разрядку в том смысле,
They strengthened the mistrust of the Soviet Union towards the United States.
недоверие Советского Союза к Соединенным Штатам